Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about KZ's new ZNA. So ZNA is their new hybrid. It is a 1+1. It is a one dynamic driver, 12 millimeters, and you can kind of see it's that brass guy right there. And there is a one balanced armature, which is a little harder to see, but it's actually in this little bump out on this side. So it's that little silvery rectangle there sitting in the corner. So also new, KZ decided to, I think these are a blast from the past. I think these are actually really old KZ tips, very, very wide bore tips, and we'll talk about that in a minute or two. Also on the back faceplate is actually kind of a design that we've seen before. I don't think it's been this particular exact faceplate, but similar design and very nice. I think the kind of the dark metal with the dark translucent shell actually works out quite well as far as a look. So let's kind of jump into it. And what I will say about their 12 millimeter, and this isn't the first 12 millimeter they've delivered, but after the third time, I think they need to kind of take a step back and kind of go back to what we talked about on the planar driver. They really need a showcase for a 12 millimeter driver. Why should people invest in 12 millimeter drivers? What's the benefit of a larger driver? I think beyond the technical capabilities they talk about in the marketing, people need to hear it and feel why a 12 millimeter is different than any of their other 10 millimeter drivers. And I think the magic of a 12 millimeter dynamic driver isn't the overwhelming base shelf, kind of what they delivered here, a really huge base shelf. That doesn't necessarily showcase the capabilities of the driver. It just gives you a large amount of bass that you can do on sort of almost any dynamic driver. But a 12 millimeter can really have a richer, deeper, more extended tactile bass experience without boosting it to those large levels like 15 decibels or 14 decibels, which I think is what this guy is. So, I don't know. For some reason, KZ has a fascination with large bass shelves, and I think that really showcases their drivers, and they've done it often enough. But, when you really get down to critically listening to it, the larger bass shelves don't necessarily do too much for you as far as discerning whether one driver is better than another. It just sort of clouds the issue and makes it harder to do so. So I do think they need to revisit this idea of just doing a 12 millimeter dynamic driver set, probably balanced like EDA balanced or balanced like one of their other sets that were very popular. But, a tuning that is essentially more balanced than what you get on ZNA. So second, like I said, the tips. So these tips are super wide. If you've actually purchased any previous KZ sets, their Starline tips actually have a more narrow bore. And these are huge and wide. And what that really does for you, what it does for me anyway, what it does for you is a little bit more unknown. But for me, I think what these tips do, it really gets you from being buried under that base shelf, because it's a large base shelf, and you really need to use these included tips. And let's take a quick look at what the base shelf actually looks like. So, you're pretty much looking at something that's 4 decibels over EDA balanced. So, you just think about that for a second. That is quite a few decibels over a set that they call balanced. So by giving you tips that have such a wide bore, they're attempting to bring ZNA's bass shelf, sort of how you hear it, to be more in line with their balanced version. And it's also going to bring this down, and this is going to sound a little bit pushed forward. So again, to be a little more like balance. And the question is, why do it this way? They have a balanced tuning which works. They have a driver which is very capable. Why not tune it to be balanced, as in their set that was actually called EDA balanced and a very popular set that people liked, and instead deliver something that, sort of requires you to use tips to adjust the tuning, and that leaves a whole lot of variables as to how that is going to affect your ear. How it affects my ear may be slightly different from how it affects in your ear, but, these also require you to have some bass because you're dropping the bass and it's pushing the upper mids forward. So if you don't have enough bass, it's going to sound a little bit thin. If you have too much bass, you're still going to get caught in that bass shelf and it's going to sound a little bit overwhelming as well. And like I said, how these work in your ears, that's really your mileage may vary. Tips are very, very dependent on the person wearing them and how they fit in your ear. And it's sort of a risky move to deliver a set that the tuning sort of requires it. And I understand they did it with PR1 Pro and with foam tips and just affecting the upper treble. I think that is a less risky proposition. I think that works out pretty well. Here, delivering a set where you see these huge wide bore tips, if these were on any other set, on any other review, I think you would sort of question that tuning that requires such wide bore tips, and is that something that you really need in your collection? So yeah, I think it's just a kind of an odd choice for me, and I didn't quite get it. I mean, I get it as to how it affects the tuning and what they tried to do. And like I said, for me, I think the tips do work as they were intended. It definitely sounds a little more balanced and a bit brighter than it looks on the graph. And I think that was the intention. So I will say, for me, it works. I think for other reviewers, you're going to see mixed results. For people who bought it and listened to it, I think there's going to be some mixed results as to, how these tips actually work in everyone's ear. The not as good. Relying on tips with such a big V can work, but you end up with a more fun, high-energy sound than natural. It's really hard to refine tuning only through tips. Tips can push you, it can kind of lean the tuning in a direction. It can refine the tuning, but if you're really relying on the tips to change the tuning in a drastic way, I think that's a little more difficult. So the vocals here, for me anyway, with these tips sound a little pushed, a little bit thinner than natural, and the treble is a lot more inconsistent because they're sort of in a balance now. And I think this does work well in short, high-energy sessions, like at a gym where you aren't listening critically, just enjoying it. And that should sound a little familiar. That's sort of a classic KZ house sound style, high-energy, fun. I think this 1+1 kind of goes back to that type of sound, so I sort of get it. Tips definitely help on the bassy songs, but eventually you'll get enough bass where it will overwhelm the mids a bit. So the bass, like we said, the wide tips bring that bass down to more typical KZ levels. At least that's how it sounds to me. For me, there is less bloat than I expected. The 12mm, again, this 12mm dynamic driver is fine. It can probably do some really nice bass, but they really need to tune it to the point where you can actually hear those things come through. But it does get a lot of help from that brighter upper range. Again, these tips are going to make it apparently sound a little bit brighter, and having that brightness really balances out with that deep bass, and it kind of cuts through, and everything appears a little more balanced than it does on the graph. So sounds controlled until you hit the wrong track, like Lucas Graham's 7 Years. It's actually a pretty cool song because it kind of goes along and it sounds quite fine, and then you hear the bass kick in, and then you're like, oh yeah, this thing has a huge bass shelf, and eventually it just gets to be a bit overwhelming and a bit swallowed up in the bass and a little bit too distracting. So the mids, the tough part, there's really just a couple things happening all at once. That big V shape tends to give you recessed mids, right? Or at least have the bass and the treble kind of rise above the vocals or the whole midsection, and that's sort of what happens with Lucas Graham's. But at the same time, you've got these big wide bore tips which tend to emphasize the upper mid, so those kind of come forward, pushed forward. So you end up opening up the vocals, pushed forward in a way that counters that V recession, but it tends to affect the stage. So the vocals are now super close to you, super intimate. And I think it's probably the right choice. I think they probably better to keep the vocals forward in this case, but a more refined tip, something that may not be as open, may have been a better trade-off between pushing everything so forward to counter the big bass shelf. Some middle ground may have been a little nicer to get you a little more height in the stage, a little bit space in front of you for the vocal, so it sounded a little bit more natural. I think they just could have. I think these are the ones that they've used in the past, so I'm sure they didn't feel like developing new tips just for this set. Treble, tuning by tips is very, like I said, just your mileage may vary. And I think this one is, it creates a lower imbalance because it pushes that whole bit forward. And it's really harder to hear the BA extension. It's really hard to figure out if there's a BA in this at all from the sound because it's a big V, and whether it's a dynamic driver with a big V or a 1+1, they both kind of sound similar in this case. So just so much energy and forwardness in that lower treble that it's a very much a more fun than refined tuning. And like I said, it's sort of reminiscent of KZ's past 1+1 sets of the past, and I think that's probably what they were going for here. And I think we all like to have audiophile reference tunings and neutral tunings and balance tunings, but this one actually goes back to, I think, KZ's past, and it's just a fun gym set, which, for those of you who've been following KZ for a few years, that will kind of ring a bell as to what this one actually sounds like. Stage, again, maybe it's just the tuning, maybe it's the tips, but this one lost the height. And especially with recent sets, KZ has actually had quite a bit of height in their soundstage. This one really lost it. The width is actually pretty good, but the upper mids, when they come forward that much and it's really in your face, it kind of throws off the space in the stage quite a bit. So again, it really sounds fun in short sessions, but not as natural or as big as you're sort of expecting if you purchase some recent KZ sets. So that's what I got on ZNA. So thank you guys again for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.